I'm going to suggest that we start. A number of people are still joining, so we expect to hear the pinging sound over the next couple of minutes, but it'll die down. Again, on behalf of the organizers, which are the Partnership for Maternal Newborn Child Health, the Interparliamentary Union, the World Health Organization, Countdown to 2030, Living Goods, and the Africa Population Health and Research Center. I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to join us, as you've done over the past couple of weeks. For those who are joining for the first time, this series of webinars aim to increase the understanding of parliamentary staff in sub-Saharan Africa on the state of women's, children's, and adolescent health, including what the burden is, what the trends are, and some of the inequities linked to that issue, and then how legislation and budget can be used to support improvements in health outcomes. So during webinar 1, you'll have heard from Nancy at the World Health Organization on the current burden around women's, children's, and adolescent health and some of the key challenges, and from Sheikh at the APHRC on some of the inequities that women, children, and adolescents face, pointing to the fact that their wealth actually has a massive impact on already very tense potential health outcomes. During the second webinar, which was last week, we heard from Rachel on what kinds of legislation can support improved women's, children's, and adolescent health outcomes, and how the different steps in the legislative process can be adapted to improve women's, children's, and adolescent health. We also heard from Bashir on some of the policy change recommendations associated with certain laws that can improve or hamper the health of the adolescent sexual reproductive health of young girls on the continent. That follows through well to this week, where we will hear from Ndlovu, the director of the Center for Economic Governance and Accountability in Africa, on how we can enhance budgetary oversight for improved women's, children's, and adolescent health. We'll also hear from our partners in Ghana on their experience around this. Again, as for all of the webinars, you should have received the background documents for this session, and those are in the same link where you will have background documents for the previous webinars, as well as the presentations and webinar recording for those. Again, as for all webinars, we hope that this will be an interactive session, and encourage you to ask any questions, make any reflections in the chat box while partners are presenting, and if not, just raise your hand, and during discussion time, you can take the floor as you wish. With that, we also request that everyone try to stay on mute as much as possible so that we can hear the presenters. And so with that, without further ado, I'm gonna ask Nhlanhla if he can walk us through the first presentation. Nhlanhla, over to you.
Thanks so much, Katie. Good morning, everyone. As Katie has introduced me, my name is Nhlanhla Ndlovu, working for CEGAA, and I'm based in South Africa. I'm going to take you through budgeting and also looking at how parliamentary staff could actually engage with the budget to advance work done on maternal or on women, child, and adolescent health. I'm going to try and share my screen.
Super.
Can you see it?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Making the budget work for women, child, and adolescent health, understanding and enhancing budget oversight for women, child, and adolescent health matters. So I would like to start by sharing a quick summary of the results from the survey that was done before this session, basically to try and understand how people have engaged with the budget process, what their experiences are, but also in terms of identifying skills that will be needed for parliamentary staff to actively engage with the budget process to advance the health issues that we are looking at. So one of the questions tried to figure out how familiar are we with the budget process, and we actually found that almost 41% of the participants today were not familiar with the budget cycle, with around 43% who were somewhat familiar and 15% very familiar. So basically you can see it's a mix. Some people are familiar with the budget cycle, others are not. So in this session, I'll try to assume that everybody are not familiar, so that basically we start from the basics, so that we bring everybody on board around the budget cycle issues. Involvement in the budget process, 37% yes and 63% no. So here we would like to know to what extent are parliamentary staff able to be involved or to engage with the budget process. So we'll look at issues that we need to monitor as people that are within Parliament to make sure that the parliamentary to make sure that the budget process works for women, child, and adolescent health. How has the budget process enhanced or inhibited resource allocation for women, child, and adolescent health? Most answers indicated that there has been limited enhancement, but then others indicated that not much evidence is available, so they don't have much experience in terms of monitoring the budget process and how it actually inhibits or enhances allocations for women, child, and adolescent health. A question around experience in budget research, analysis, and advocacy. 36% no experience, 39% little experience, 21% good experience, and 4% extensive experience. And again, you can see there is a mix of engagement with the budget, as well as in terms of analyzing it and using evidence for advocacy. So again, we'll just assume that everybody has not really engaged with this, and then we'll basically go or do this session from the basics to bring everybody on board. Do you think budget work would help in achieving your country's goals for women, child, and adolescent health? 96% yes and 4% no. And the ones who said no basically indicated that it does not help to allocate resources if you do not have the right policy. So we need to go back and make sure that policies are right before we can then start allocating resources. So basically this indicates that before we can do budget analysis, we should also start by doing some kind of policy analysis to make sure that the policies are responding to the identified needs. But then there was a question around specific budget monitoring skills that are needed. Some people wanted to have some basic understanding of the budget process, but then others wanted to know how they can engage with it, to be able to influence it, and asking if there is room for parliamentary staff to engage with the budget process in a way that will influence the actual allocations that we see at the end of the day. Others with interest on budget analysis skills, gender-based budgeting skills, child rights budgeting skills. Unfortunately, in this session, we'll just go through the budget cycle and then look at issues around health financing. We will not have time to do number crunching. Unfortunately, we will not have enough time to do number crunching, but I think moving forward, it's something that you could look at if members are really interested in learning how to do number crunching. It's something that we could provide some support on. And others were interested in knowing how to do expenditure tracking against objectives, which is also important, because if we talk about the budget, we talk about allocations, but then we also need to know how much is actually spent and what are the results of that. So there are other areas that were identified needing support to make sure that the women, child, and adolescent health objectives are actually achieved. So based on this background results from the survey, these are the objectives that I'll try to cover in this session. Specifically to be more familiar with budget basics and also to try and demystify the budget because a lot of people feel that budgeting is for finance people. But in this session, we'll try and indicate that everybody can do work around budgeting. You don't need to be a finance guru to engage with it. So basically breaking down the concepts so that we can have a better understanding. Reflect on your understanding of your country's budget process and how to engage with it. And here we'll start by having a short presentation from Ghana in terms of learning from the Ghana experience, how the budget process unfolds. And then we'll have some inputs from everybody in the group regarding how their budget process goes. And then briefly define and assess the fiscal space to understand budget feasibility and sustainability issues. So this is quite important that if we say we want to do budget advocacy work, we need to have a bigger picture in terms of understanding, is there enough resources to even demand a certain amount of money to be allocated to women, child, and adolescent health. So looking at the definition of fiscal space and also then looking at what other innovative funding mechanisms are countries using to fund health. And then I'll share some takeaway messages for continuous engagement with budget matters affecting women, child, and adolescent health. So let's start the session by looking at the budget basics, looking at terminology and some examples of budget monitoring. So basically, we look at the budget as a state policy instrument. So we believe that the budget is a government financial policy document, which is legal, which must be used as designed. So basically, we need to then understand how is it framed. So basically defining what is a budget, what is it that we are looking at. So a budget is a financial statement containing revenue, expenditure, and deficit or surplus estimates, which indicate how a household, organization, or government plans to use its expected resources to meet its goals for a given period. So you can see that this is broader than just financial allocations. So we are talking about a financial plan which will tell us about where is government getting money from, how much is government able to accumulate with regard to revenue, but then out of our revenue, how much is government deciding to spend on our issues. But then once we have decided on how much we are going to spend, do we have enough money left, or are we running short of funding to do everything that government seeks to do? So basically looking at whether we've got a deficit and surplus, and if we have a deficit, and then the plan, the budget plan needs to tell us where is the additional funding going to come from. Are we going to take loans? Are we going to get donors to come and assist? What is it that we are going to do to cover the deficit? But then we also need to be very specific in terms of planning how we want to use the resources. So there needs to be proper plans of making sure that the resources are utilized in the right way to meet the specific goals that have been defined by the government. And again, the issue around the given period. So the budget needs to respond to a specific given period because there are objectives that we are setting to achieve. Then it means at the end of this given period, we should go back and say, did we achieve what we had said? Did the money work for us, or was there wastage, or we were very efficient and we can show good results? So basically, looking at the budget, it is quite comprehensive in a way that we can actually understand what are government priorities expressed in monetary terms. Looking at the budgeting system, we say budgeting is concerned with taking decisions that will translate policy priorities into practice through resource allocations. So basically, we believe that without budgeting, there is a lot of policies that cannot be implemented. So basically, the budget provides an engine for the vehicle to move towards achieving government goals in terms of priorities that have been set. So without the budget, it is very unlikely that policies will be implemented. But then we are looking at budgeting as an expression of policy preferences. Budgeting is inherently a political exercise, not a technical one. So here we basically need to look at how the budget is formulated and which decisions are being funded. And then you'll find that most of the time, it's the policies that guide or drives allocations. So then we need to look back and say, how are these policies really developed and who approves these policies? Then you actually find that it is the political leadership that dictates or that lead in terms of which policies should be implemented and when. And then decisions around those priority policies are going to affect the allocation of their resources. So if we are not able to engage with the political process of designing policies, then engaging with the budget will not help us much, because we might find that allocations are going to inappropriate policies. So we need to make sure that we create the link between policies, budgeting, and implementation, so that at the end of the day, the budget responds to people's needs. Budgeting should not be divorced from the strategic management objectives, and then the question is why? So here we say, because policy and strategic objectives are unlikely to be achieved without the requisite resources. So very important that we bridge the gap between strategic planning and budgeting to make sure that the budget talks to the needs or to the priorities that have been identified. In some places, you'll find that people doing strategic planning are in one room, and then other people doing budgeting are in a separate room. And then when it's time for implementation, you find that the budget does not talk to the plans. And then there are problems. Then you find that there are problems of underspending or problems of overspending because the plans did not talk to the budget and vice versa. So here we basically emphasize the need to bridge the gap between budgeting and strategic planning or policy development to make sure that the budget works for the people. So as I've indicated, that you might find that there is a gap between policy and implementation, and then we feel that if we actually look at the budget, we can actually bridge the gap. Because you might find that the services that are being delivered are not really talking to the policies. And then the question is, are these policies sufficiently resourced to be able to be implemented? Then if we look at the budget, we can actually see why is it that the services are not really delivering on the policies that have been identified. So we get a lot of people doing policy analysis. Other people are monitoring implementation and evaluating programs and services. And then we find that most of the time there is a gap in terms of who is doing budget monitoring and expenditure tracking. And then we feel that if we spend time on budgeting, we can actually complement policy and service analysis and basically strengthen our advocacy because there is money, there is power in the money. So looking at the budget can actually help us to see why is it that we are not achieving our set objectives, or why is it that some of the plans that we are hoping to implement are not really working for us. So looking at money matters can help us see why things work and why things do not work. And then we say budgets have 3 outcomes that parliamentarians can look at. So it's very important because there has been a question around what role can parliamentarians play in the budget process, because you find that Parliament is not part of the crafting of the budget, but then they only see the budget being presented to them for approval. Then the questions are, is there any other way that parliamentarians can actually or actively engage with the budget or with the budget process. So we feel that there are 3 outcomes that parliamentarians can monitor or should monitor to continuously engage with the budget process. So basically the first one is ensuring fiscal discipline. Here we talk about the aggregate level of spending, how much is spent. So basically looking at levels of spending, making sure that tax and debt is affordable and sustainable. So we cannot spend more than what we have. So that is one of the roles that parliamentarians can play to make sure that government is disciplined with regard to aggregate levels of spending. The second one is looking at the composition of spending. What is money spent on? Very important question, because it's good to have a budget or to have allocations made, but where are these allocations being spent? So parliamentarians could also look at issues around allocative efficiency, looking at whether the resources are spent on the right combination of programs according to strategic priorities. Basically an issue of monitoring how the money is going, or how the money is being spent. And is it being spent on the right things? And are we getting results for that? Talking about operational efficiency. So here is about how well is the money spent. We need to get the most for the money spent and minimize wastage. So it is good to have the allocation, and the money can be divided among good programs that we feel, yes, these programs are going to work for us, but then is the money well spent? So now we need to look at issues around efficiency, because we know that government works with scarcity. We do not have enough money for everything. So each and every penny that is allocated must work for us. We need to make sure the money is spent well. We minimize wastage. We do not go on shopping sprees. We do not do what we call financial dumping, where you find that the money is just wasted towards the end of the financial year because we haven't had time to do everything that we wanted to do. So we just waste and spend on unnecessary things. So these are the questions that parliamentarians could also help in monitoring, making sure that the money is spent well, and then we get most out of the little resources that we have allocated. So I would like to share some examples on budget analysis to see how can budget monitoring help us as parliamentary staff. Here I've got examples from Zambia and South Africa, but let us start with Zambia. So here we are looking at trends in key child indicators. So basically checking how are the child mortality rates increasing or decreasing in Zambia. And according to this 2018 Zambia Demographic and Health Survey, we can say that the mortality rates are actually declining. And also looking at stunting, you can see from 2007 to 2018, there has been a decline in the rates, which is good news. So it will be nice to actually see how has financing impacted on this. So one would say, what is it that Zambia has done to actually reduce child mortality rates? Is it money or is it something else? So what is going on? But then if we work from the budget perspective, we can say actually investing in health can actually reduce child or maternal mortality. But then we need evidence to be able to make that conclusion. So budget analysis can actually help us better understand how financial investments can actually change the world we live in, or can change a specific issue that we are monitoring. So how is Zambia allocating resources in a way that we can say this change in mortality rates? And this is the Zambia health allocations from 2014 to 2019. And you can see by looking at the bottom line there, change in size of national budget. You can see that the national budget is actually growing from year to year. You can see we saw a massive growth of 30% in the national budget in 2014. and it grew again by 9% in 2015, and by 10% in 2019. So you can see that the national budget is actually growing, but then we want to know, out of the national budget, how much is actually going to health, and is the share of health the share of health budget increasing in the national budget. And then we look at the change in health sector budget allocation, and you can see that the health allocation actually declined by 1% in 2016. And then if you look at 2017, you can see that the budget grew massively by 30%, and it grew further by 18% in 2018, and again by 19% in 2019. So you can see that the government is trying to pick up the pieces from what happened in 2016 by allocating more money to health, which we can actually link to the previous slide where we saw that there has been a decline in mortality rates. So basically seeing more investment being pumped into health, also affecting our health issues that we are monitoring. But then also we can look at the share of health budget in the national budget. So basically this is quite important because we know a lot of African countries committed to spending 15% of their national budget on health. So with regard to the Abuja Declaration, how is Zambia faring? You can see here that Zambia is spending about 9.3% of their national budget going towards health. So we can say this is far below the Abuja Declaration, which stipulates that 15% should be allocated to health. But then the question is, are these health allocations growing? So we want to make sure that the allocations, even though they are below 15%, but they are still growing, because we know health needs are growing from year to year. So we need to see progress in health allocations. So very important to actually monitor the budget with regard to the growth in line with the growing health needs. But then we can also do budget analysis to see how equitable the budget is. We can look at how much are we spending per capita. We can even compare geographic areas to check if region 1 is spending more than region 2, and what are the reasons for that. So basically building evidence to mobilize for more resources to go to one region as compared to the other, or basically to say the most needy regions are not getting enough, and we can see this from budget analysis, and we then push government to allocate to those needy areas. Trends in South Africa, health allocations. So this graph basically shows that there has been a positive trend with regard to government allocations, looking at consolidated government allocations, that is the total government budget, which has been growing from 2014 to 2020. You can see that also if you look at consolidated social sector allocations are growing. And then if you look at the gray bar there, you can see that consolidated health allocations are also increasing from 144 billion rands in 2014 to 240 billion rands in 2020. So basically we can see that there is a positive trend with regard to allocations. Then the question is, since we are concerned about women, child and adolescent health, how much is actually going to that program from the health sector? Unfortunately, I could not get all the data I needed to do that analysis, so we could show it here. But it's quite important that we actually look at the trends of allocations for specific programs that we are interested in. Because you might find that the health sector budget is growing, but the issue that you are interested in is actually not funded from that growing budget. So we also need to sit down and do the analysis to see how much of the growing health budget is going to my issue. And then here the question is, how much of the health budget is going to women, child and adolescent health? And I think it's something that I would like to motivate members of this workshop to actually go and do some quick number crunching, where when you get back home, to see if actually the growing health budgets are working for women, child, and adolescents by looking at how much is going to the programs that are relevant to them. So if you look at this, you can see that although the national budget is growing, the health budget is not growing as fast as the national budget. And we can look at that by basically looking at how much of the national government budget is going to health. And if you look at the orange line right at the top, you can see that South Africa is spending about 12.5% of its national budget on health, even though there was some decline in 2016, but you can see that the budget is above 12%. But then now the question would be, how much of that is going to women, child, and adolescent health? And we need to do some number crunching to get a better understanding of that. Can I quickly pause here and check if there are any questions? If I could take 2 or 3 minutes to respond to quick questions that you might have. Are we all good? Okay, it looks like we are all good. Okay, and now my slides have frozen. Let me see how to start again. Let's share. I hope you can see that.
Yes, it's back up.
It's back up. Okay, thank you so much. So now the next session is going to look at the budget cycle. And at this moment, I would like to invite our Ghana colleagues, Mr. Mohamed Nyaksi, who is the Director of Research in Ghana Parliament, as well as Ms. Shiba Nana, who is the Principal Assistant Clerk, to basically take us through a quick outline of the Ghana's budget cycle, but also indicate who the key stakeholders in the budget cycle are in Ghana.
Okay,
Mr.
thank you very
Nyaksi,
much.
I'm not sure. I've got
Hello,
your slides.
good morning.
Good morning.
Quick one, Alhaj is facing a few problems, so give us a second. I'm trying to hook him up. He's online here. It may be a bit, the sound may be a bit low. He's speaking through my phone, so I'm going to hook up on a speaker right now so you can hear him better.
Okay.
Alhaj, carry on while we... Can you hear him?
Sheba, we
No.
can't hear him.
Hang on a second, hang on a second. Alhaj, please wait. Alhaji, please wait. I want to turn on the speaker. You're not loud enough.
Okay.
Just a few seconds.
All right.
Okay.
Right, he's gonna speak through a speaker.
Okay, and I've got your slides up already.
Right.
Yeah, I can see the slide.
We can hear him a little better now.
Can you hear Alhaji a bit better now?
Yeah, a little better. Try.
Right, okay, Alhaj, please continue speaking while I hook you up.
All right, thank you. Yeah, quickly, the budget process in Ghana follows the traditional four-stage process: formulation, financial approval, implementation, and audit and reporting. And all the processes are traditional to whatever happens around the globe. Formulation, financial approval, budget implementation, all the stakeholders in there are outlined in the next slide. Please, can you go to the next slide? So what happens is that
Sheba, he just faded out again.
Alhaj, he says you should please repeat yourself. Alhaj, he says you should repeat yourself.
But the budget flows from the plan prepared by the National Medium-Term Plan, which is undertaken by the Planning Committee. Now, the medium-term plan is expected to capture all government priorities, including spending on health and other matters, gender spending and all that. If you go to the website of the committee, you will find the economic development plan. Now, after that, the draft budget is sent to the cabinet. First of all, the cabinet has to approve the fiscal strategic document, which links the spending with the plan. So when this is done, then it is brought back to the ministry, and then a second draft is prepared and sent to cabinet for finalizing the draft budget for presentation to Parliament. Now, when it is in Parliament, now when the cabinet is undertaking this particular step, they ensure that all the key priorities of government, as I mentioned, are included and nothing is left out. So all issues relating to health, education, gender issues, once it is on the agenda of cabinet, they will make sure that it is reflected, all the sector agencies reflect that. Now, when it comes to Parliament at the scrutiny and approval or rejection stage, Parliament provides a forum where interest groups and other stakeholders can join the process when the budget is referred to the
Sorry, Ms. Shiba, he's fading away again.
Okay. If it is inadequate, they make the recommendation to the House for approval. MDAs are expected to implement the plans of government. And so it is critical that they capture all the central government programs and projects relating to health and gender issues in the budget. Now, even at a much lower stage, which is the district level, this is where the operations take place and all the government interventions relating to the subject and the discussion take place. And so when that happens, at the auditing stage, what is happening is Auditor General in examining the expenditures, because we are running a program-based budgeting. So the Auditor General will scrutinize expenditures in relation to what was budgeted and reported, make sure that money actually were spent on the priorities that were budgeted for. And so at this stage, to civil society have the opportunity, especially at the preparation stage, to make their input. So we normally have interest groups such as the Ghana Association of the Disabled, women groups, giving the opportunity to make their input into the budget. In fact, we prepare citizens' budget alongside the one that is brought to Parliament, and it is available at the Ministry of Finance website. Secondly, to make sure that expenditures are reported and shown that we deliver on results, the budget classification in Ghana, apart from economic classification, we have the program classification, which makes sure that all the programs of MDAs are properly reflected in the budget. We have classification by functions of government, so it is possible to see, the chart of accounts capture all these things, so that at the reporting stage you can do a summary and see how much was spent on health, how much was spent on education, how much was spent on gender issues, and then we also have key interventions by government, which we call social intervention programs. And there's another classification that makes sure that any institution that is spending in this direction to report expenditure using the appropriate chart of account, so that it can, government can monitor that particular spending. So this is just briefly the process that we'll go through. So I think my colleague will, because she's in charge of gender matters here, she deals with their budget, and I'm sure she has some addition to make relating to the programs of her ministry. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Was Alaji quite clear? Because I know we had a few glitches with the speaker. If there's anything you'd like him to repeat.
I think we could hear him, but maybe if we can give you an opportunity to give some quick summary and then share anything else that you feel was missing. But he indicated that you might be able to share more on women, child, and adolescent health experiences.
Exactly. I run the gender committee in Parliament, and one problem that we've always faced is the lack of funding. Because a lot of our programs on a number of occasions, or a lot of times, are donor funded. So if the funding doesn't come in, then it means your program or your project would be stalled. That is one. Another thing is usually the funds from the finance ministry that is supposed to actually run the programs are not released on time. And that is one thing that the ministry always complains about. Delay in releases, delay in releases. Another thing we should also know is that the Ministry of Gender and Children is essentially a service-oriented ministry. So if the budget for service is cut down by the Ministry of Finance, it's almost like you're cutting off their lifeline. And also, I believe there's a disconnect between our planning and our implementation, because somebody asked if we're part of the MTEF planning. Usually they would ask opinions from various committees, people would make input, but for Parliament to really be part of the NDPC, I mean, they are the planning team or planning organization, we're not fully involved in that. You know, government has its policies, and then the budget is prepared according to the policy which they wish to prioritize. Unfortunately, prioritization of policies and the implementation depends on money. You know, so if the money doesn't come in, then you would have a beautiful plan on paper, but it cannot really be implemented. But I would say for the Ministry of Gender, that they have a number of very beautiful policies that have been helping over the years. One thing, when it comes to children, for instance, we've got the school feeding program that's been running for a number of years, and that makes sure that each child in school or of school-going age in the public sector, in the public schools, gets one hot meal a day. You know, so every child that is in the public school sector gets a meal a day. And we also have another one, that's a school feeding program. Then there's another one called the LEAP, Livelihood and Empowerment Against Poverty. Now, this one is for the more vulnerable, you know, so it doesn't really matter whether it's male or female, very old people, people under the poverty line, you know, so they give them some funds every month. They identify these people and they help them out. Then we also have the LIPW, that's the Labor Intensive Public Works. This has actually been is a short-term seasonal employment thing that helps women, almost about 61% female representation, and delivered to about 942 community assets and social, groupings. You know, so far, as at last year, they had about 40 school blocks and cashew workers, seedlings. They provide seedlings for farmers, you know, farmers who can't afford it. Then there was a pilot program as well under the Gender Ministry, the Productive and Financial Inclusion. That is also akin to the LEAP, but this one is more to empower them to produce for themselves, to make money for themselves. So we've got basket and hat weaving, the guinea fowl rearing, soap making, shea butter extraction, dawa, it's from a tree over here, it's made into a spice. Then we had the Microfinance and Small Scale Center, MASLOC. That also deals with people who cannot access bank funds to set up small businesses or to improve their businesses. And then, of course, we've got the Human Trafficking Unit under the Gender Ministry as well, that looks into issues related to not just human trafficking, but then child abuse and abuse of women and abuse of anybody, you know, when it comes to using them for work, illegal work. You know, in our culture, whatever work your parents do, when you close from school, you help. Some people will do a little farming in the morning, go to school and come back. That is different. But we're talking about children being on farms, children fishing, you know, in dangerous waters when they're supposed to be in school. When it comes to that, you'll be arrested and prosecuted. You know, so I know we don't have much time, but another problem we have is the monitoring of the various committees at large. All the committees, when it comes to monitoring, you know, it's also a matter of time and a matter of funding. You know, so if you're not, the committee or parliament is not well resourced to carry out these monitoring programs, it's a bit difficult. You know, and also when it comes to numbers in the House, for instance, when you need numbers in the House to work, it is difficult for it to be approved for a committee of, mine committees of 25-member committee, to even allow half of those people to leave the House for a 2-day monitoring program. So usually those things are done over the weekends, and you know it's over the weekends so that the MPs go to their constituencies. So we usually have to program and reprogram, you know, so monitoring has not been strong. I can say that for a fact, that monitoring has not been strong. But the Public Accounts Committee does quite a good job of going through the Auditor General's reports and then sometimes bringing people to book. Unfortunately, it's usually after the fact, because I think for now, the auditor reports they've got is like 2018, 2019, you know, and some people have retired, they're no longer at post, you know, so it really becomes a moot point. Because unfortunately, when you call a meeting to look at those auditors' reports, it is the new officer at desk who would come and make the presentation and answer the questions. You know, but it's the one who's gone on retirement who was in charge of all of whatever happened. So that's also, you know, a bit dicey, you know, but basically that's it in a nutshell. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Miss Shiba.
Shiba.
I think Shiba.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think you and Mr. Mohammed have given us a good picture of how the budget is crafted in Ghana.
Are you online?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, but you have also given us some very practical examples of how parliamentarians can engage with the budget, also indicating the limitations that you have, especially regarding the resources that are not there for parliamentarians to do their monitoring or their oversight role fully. So I think I will just jump to the next session now and then basically request our colleagues in the group to jot down their questions should they have any questions for you. And then
Thank you very much.
And then we can have a quick discussion at a later stage.
Thank you so much for giving us a chance. So much.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay. So given that we have had a very good picture of the budget process from Ghana, and I think as Mr. Mohammed indicated, that this is kind of a traditional budget cycle format. I think most of the countries in Africa are following the same format, and then it differs in terms of how each parliament engages with the government on resourcing. So I think now what I'm going to do basically will be to try and identify areas where members of parliament and parliamentary staff can engage with each of the 4 phases of the budget process, that as Mr. Mohammed outlined them. But also keeping in mind that even though there might be room for engagement, the issue of funding is always affecting what Parliament can do. So then now, when we look at the health financing at a later stage, maybe it will also help to ask questions in terms of how can Parliament mobilize resources for itself to make sure that it is able to play its oversight role effectively. So just now I'm going to do a quick summary of the budget cycle. As it was indicated, we start by having what is called budget formulation, when the government formulates or basically drafts the budget in line with the broader strategic and budgeting frameworks. But then the question is, what is it that parliamentarians can do during formulation stage? So here, parliamentarians can ensure that legislation and policies are developed in line with the Constitution. So even though parliamentarians are not part of the number crunching group that allocates the resources, but they can ensure that legislation and policies are correct to inform resource allocation. But also making sure that there is evidence from the ground, from constituencies, on issues that need government funding. So here, members of parliament could actually use their constituencies to identify areas that need to be prioritized in budget policy decisions. And also maybe using relevant policies to make sure that the policies that have been approved are actually funded. So basically use policy documents to guide where the money is going. I think that's where Parliament has got power. This can even be taken on when you budget enactment. So when the budget is presented to Parliament, government needs to ensure that they present in line with the policies that are approved. And parliamentarians can ask questions around whether this budget, or to what extent is this budget going to assist us implement a specific policy that has been approved. One other thing that I think is important during formulation stage is for members of parliament to push or to mobilize for specific budget line items to be included in the budget. Because if your issue is not reflected in the budget, how can you see if any allocations are made to it? So mobilizing for specific budget line items to be visible in the budget, so you can keep track of what is being allocated to your issue. But then when the budget comes to Parliament for enactment or for approval, parliamentarians can also engage with it. So budget enactment basically involves the Minister of Finance or the President presenting the budget to legislature. And then the budget gets debated, it gets amended, and then it gets approved. But we have seen very little cases where the budget was amended. Most of the time, there is no time for the budget to be amended. So the budget is just approved and then it is implemented. So the question has been, does Parliament really have power to amend the budget? Or would that be look like Parliament is actually challenging its own government to go back and fix the problems? So then you find that there might be some political issues involved when you amend the budget, because it means now you do not have trust in your government. But then the question is, does Parliament really have those powers and independence to actually challenge what government brings to the front and engage with it? So during enactment, parliamentarians can actually check if the budget reflects health priorities of women, children, and girls, and also say that we are not going to approve this budget until this budget includes enough funding for women, children, and girls. And once the budget is approved in Parliament, it is then executed. Basically, this is when implementation takes place. So again, parliamentarians can engage with the implementation phase of the budget by consulting with constituencies to see if quality services are delivered and meet their needs and standards. asking questions to ministers and officials on commitments made by government and progress towards achieving those. Hold committee meetings, specifically on women, child, and adolescent health interventions. And also check if funds are dispersed. We've been told from Ghana the experience of funding not being dispersed, and then you find that committees are not able to do any work because the money has not been dispersed. So it's quite important that Parliament keeps track of allocations to make sure that the money is going to the implementing agencies so that their constituencies can access the services. And again, keep on monitoring spending against objectives as defined in the policies. And then the last phase is budget oversight and assessment, which is basically auditing, which we heard about from Ghana again. So here, members of parliament can actually examine audit reports and take appropriate action, but there are some problems here. Sometimes we find that the people that were responsible for spending are no longer there, as we've been told from Ghana. So who do you hold accountable if the people that wasted the money are no longer there? But then during auditing, Parliament can actually look at performance reports as well, looking at financial and non-financial, because it's good to look at financial performance, but if we are not looking at non-financial performance in terms of how much have we achieved against the targets that we set, then we might be missing the point. So we also need to look at non-financial performance to see if the money is really working for us and that we are not going on shopping sprees and wasting the money. And then Parliament can also seek external stakeholders' independent monitoring and evaluation reports, and also bringing on civil society, because there's quite a lot of groups that monitor budgets. They can actually come in and also share their reports, basically to say what has been audited is actually true, is a true reflection of what is happening on the ground, and then the results are talking for themselves. So bringing other stakeholders in to assist Parliament with capacity to engage with the auditing phase of the budget. And then information from this phase will then inform formulation of next year's budget. But it's important to keep your eyes on all these phases at once. So we emphasize this, that because all these four phases of the budget cycle are happening concurrently. So you need to monitor all at once. You cannot say, I'm going to look at formulation and then after that I'm going to do something else. So you just need to have a bigger picture of what is happening in all these phases and make sure you engage with all of them at once. Because if you miss one action that is happening, you might find that the space that you had to engage with the budget is gone. So basically try to figure out or to map out how are these phases being rolled out concurrently. Just to move on, so I understand in the previous sessions there has been questions around how data is used to inform legislation or to inform budgets. And I put this picture here, hopefully to assist with our understanding of how the data is actually used to influence policies and also to influence budgets. So this is some kind of an accountability loop that we may use to better understand policy making and budgeting. But basically here, we try to emphasize that budgeting is not a process on its own. It is part of a complete policy making process. And again, we say policy making is not complete until resources are allocated and it is implemented. So when we've got good policies on paper, they are not really helping if they are not implemented. So we need to make sure that this kind of an accountability loop is complete by putting in all the elements that are required, including the budget. So basically, we start the process by ensuring that there is enough demographic and prevalence data to inform policies, because no one has basically spent time to develop policy for no reasons. There are usually reasons why a specific policy must be developed, and there is data that is available to inform that policy development process. So we need to look at whether there is enough research being done to inform policies, there is enough evidence from our constituencies to inform policy, and then once the policy is formulated, we then need to understand how much it will cost for this policy to be implemented, looking at issues around costing, looking at the cost-benefit analysis and other analysis that can be done to better understand how this policy can be implemented. Is it affordable? And if it is affordable, is it likely to give us the results that we desire, to basically say the issues that have been identified in our research can be addressed through this policy. And once we are clear of the cost implications of policy, we then look at resource allocation and budgeting. Very important to link the budget with the needs that have been identified, but also making sure that the budget has been costed, so that we don't say we have run out of money mid-year. We need to make sure that the budget is going to help us implement the program from the beginning of the financial year to the end of the financial year. So basically, we need to make that link and then ensure that there are enough structures and institutions in place to absorb the money. Because in some places you find that allocations have been made, but there are no systems in place to spend the money. Sometimes there is money, but we do not have human resources. But also, I think it's quite important that we also look at structures and institutions to make sure that allocations are actually being utilized. This is one big area which I think is important in the health sector, because we also get a lot of funding from donors who come in with money for services, but then there's no money for human resources. So we need to monitor and make sure that budget decisions are made using the right information, and to make sure that we actually achieve what we developed the policies to achieve. And then once we have looked at the structures and institutions for delivery, we then actually engage in service delivery, which then gets monitored and evaluated. So again, information from program monitoring and evaluation is supposed to provide data to inform the next year's budget. So making sure that the decisions are not thumb-sucked, but there is evidence informing the policy and budget decisions that are being made. And moving on, basically saying, is there more that parliamentarians can do around the budget cycle? Here we also say members of parliament can ensure that accountability happens. And here we have put in the accountability table, which we feel that MPs should drive in terms of the construction of this table to make sure that government is able to deliver in terms of people's needs. So this table has got 4 legs as expected. And the first leg is what is called robust financial management systems, basically saying we need strong financial management systems because there is so much money that we are working with. And then we need a financial management system that will be able to hold the data together. But then the system that can tell us how we are performing against objectives. And then at the end of the day, we can generate good reports for accountability. So financial management systems, very important. And also moving on to financial management legislation. Because if you talk about accountability, then we should hold someone responsible or accountable for some of the decisions that are made. So do we have enough financial management legislation? Is it robust enough to hold people accountable for the decisions they've made or for the actions they've taken to spend the money? So in many places, we have what is called the Public Finance Management Act, which is used as the main legislation to guide financing. So is the Public Finance Management Act being applied? Is it being respected? And parliamentarians can actually ensure that this legislation is followed. And the third leg is the Independent Auditor General. So here we emphasize independent in a way that the Auditor General's office should be able to carry out all the auditing activities without any fear or prejudice. So here we emphasize that it should be independent, so it should be able to hold everyone accountable in a way that parliamentarians and citizens can actually trust the information that comes from the audit reports. So if there are cases where you find that the Auditor General or the Supreme Audit Institution has found some challenges or some problems with spending, then Parliament should actually pick up those reports and use the financial management legislation to hold people accountable. Because sometimes, as we heard from Ghana, you find that the people that were responsible for spending are no longer there. But then what does our legislation say in cases where someone was involved, for example, in fraudulent acts, and the person is no longer in government employ? Can we follow that person so that they come back and pay the money, or can we follow them to make sure that they actually go through litigation and basically pay for what they've done? So basically, the power is again with the Parliament to make sure that the legislation is actually applied to whoever is responsible in these cases. And the last leg, sorry, can I request all of us to mute our mics? And then the last leg of the accountability is strong Parliament, active civil society, strong media, and an aware electorate. Basically saying for accountability to happen, we all need to be part of this system. We need Parliament, we need civil society, we need the media, so that everybody is basically active in this democratic process of engagement and also involving money matters. Can I request that I just move on and take the questions at the end, because I can see that time is not on our side.
Okay, but we have a couple of questions, so let's let's try to wrap up as fast as possible.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, I'll just quickly sum this up. Questions that members of Parliament can address through budget analysis. I think basically I've talked through this in this session, looking at issues around adequacy, priority given to our issues, checking if the budget is growing regarding growth rates, but looking at efficiency, whether the money is being spent and is it spent on the right things, but also looking at effectiveness, is the money being spent on the right things, and equity, are resources being allocated fairly. I think those questions are quite important for Parliament to ask, especially through the portfolio committees that engage with the government officials. And then the last session that I wanted to cover is basically to look at understanding the fiscal space and financial sustainability, to actually see if we demand increases in budget allocations for women, child and adolescent health. Is there enough space for us to demand, or is there enough space for government to allocate more to the areas that we are interested in? So the key challenges that we need to look at is whether our health system is able to raise sufficient funds for health. Are we able to remove financial risks and barriers to access? Basically saying, are we able to remove financial risks for people that are really not able to do things for themselves? And that's where we expect government to fill in the gap by providing public services. And also looking at improving efficiency and equity of resource use. Basically saying we do not have enough money, so can we be more efficient in using the resources that we have? So basically avoiding wastage. So you will get the presentation. It contains a video that I was hoping to play, but the system does not allow us. So you can take time in your office to look at this quick video, which tries to explain what fiscal space is. So basically, if we talk about fiscal space, we talk about the government capacity to provide additional budgetary resources for a desired purpose. So here we are saying, is there enough space for government to provide additional funding for this purpose that we are looking at. So, for example, the issues around scarcity. We know government has got scarce resources, but if we look at this, at the fiscal space, can we actually allocate additional money to health, even though we've got scarce resources? And then the question is, where would that money come from? So we might find that there are other innovative mechanisms that government can use to accumulate more funding so that we expand our fiscal space and then be able to spend more money on areas that we feel are important. But then outside of the government fiscal space, there is also financial space, which basically talks about the overall availability of resources for health, including the private health expenditures. So how big is our financial space, and does it allow our government to spend more on health or on other activities? So given that most African governments do not have enough money, we always find a challenge to make a balance, to make sure that everybody has got enough access to health services, talking about universal access to health. So it's always an issue of financing. And the question is, can we make this, the space bigger to make sure that we ensure universal access to health? So now I would like to maybe take about 5 minutes to quickly identify sources of funding for women, child, and adolescent health in our countries. I'll just open this up and maybe check if there are any funding sources that you feel are quite important to tap into for women, child, and adolescent health, but also to check if any country in this group has been able to come with innovative financing mechanisms, because we know that taxes are not enough, and we know that government money is not enough to do everything. But have our countries explored other opportunities to bring in more money to be able to spend on health generally, but to also spend on women, child, and adolescent health specifically? I'm going to open this opportunity for inputs from the group. And see if there are any inputs. I'm sorry, when I'm projecting, I could not see the chat box, and I can see there's been quite a lot of questions being raised.
So perhaps while we, if you can maybe put the slide back up so that people can think through funding sources. And while they do, there were just 2 questions that Moses wants to know: to what extent is zero budgeting effective in service delivery compared to baseline budgeting? And if you had any examples in the region that demonstrate the advantages. And then Nancy had a question around surveys, right? So are there any national population or health surveys that carry more weight during budgeting? Because in the countries that currently use DHS, then you're doing your policy making on very old data.
Okay, let me just put the slide back up.
Yes, and in the meantime, I've asked people to, you can either raise your hands or you can just input any comments that you have related to the questions in the chat box.
Okay, so basically, these are the key sources of health financing that most countries are using. Maybe while I respond to the questions, you can just think about any other sources that you feel are not on this list. So basically, the question around zero budgeting, I think it's quite important to note that there are different ways of developing the budget, and zero budgeting is one of the ways of doing budgeting. So zero-based budgeting actually assumes that we need to start from scratch every time we start the financial year. So basically, we start from zero. This kind of budgeting assumes that whatever has happened in the past has got no relevance to today, and today we basically need to reflect and start from scratch. So it does not really help us in terms of capital investments in terms of saying what was invested in the past. It basically says, let us start on a clean slate. Let us look at what the priorities are today, and let us allocate according to these priorities. So zero-based budgeting is excellent in making sure that current issues are addressed, because it looks at priorities as we speak, without saying, well, we committed to these programs in the past and we need to sustain these programs. It basically says, let us start from scratch and make sure that the money is going to the right priorities as we speak now. Well, I'm not sure of any country that is using zero-based budgeting, because most of the African countries are using what is called the medium-term expenditure framework, the MTEF, which basically works on rolling budget, multi-year rolling budgets. These budgets, it could be a 3-year rolling budget or a 5-year rolling budget in line with the 5-year strategic plans. So basically, the multi-year budgeting system does not allow zero-based budgeting because it assumes we have made some investments in the past and we basically need to sustain what we have started. But at the same time, we also need to review how we've been doing things and allocate additional monies on our baselines. So zero-based budgeting is good, but then also it might not work in other areas because it basically demands a lot of time and energy for people to identify priorities today, to allocate the money from today moving forward. In terms of surveys being used, so I think there's quite a lot of research that is being generated by government and by universities. There are some key universities that are used to influencing policies by generating research. So in our countries, I think we might need to identify those research agencies that are found credible and government is using them to actually develop specific policies. Yeah, but then the information from the district health systems is also used on an ongoing basis, but there are other reports that might be coming from somewhere else. But also we know that governments also has got experts that they consult on certain issues, experts and advisors. So I think it would be good for us to know who those experts and advisors are and what kind of information they use to influence budget allocations or to influence policies.
Thank you for those responses. I'm wondering whether, oh, I'm okay. We have Judy Aikens, who just provided one of the responses to your questions in terms of sources of funding for health, and she's noted UNFPA, UNICEF programs for women's children's health. I don't know whether you would consider that as part of external or donor funding, but that came through.
Yeah. I think that is also relevant because we know that a lot of UN agencies are working with governments to develop policies and also to even mobilize funding to come through for certain issues that those agencies are interested in.
I had a question that I think could go either to you or to anyone else on the call. Given the importance of getting the policies right, and I think we heard this from Ghana a little bit, and then the lack of parliamentary engagement within the policy making process, what can be done to improve that? And are there examples of countries where you know that there's effective parliamentary participation in policy making? And then how are parliamentarians working with civil society on execution and oversight in terms of making sure that they're tracking allocations and expenditure, and in terms of monitoring government performance?
Okay. On the first question, in terms of getting policies right, getting parliamentarians participate in making the policies right, I think we have some examples. I can share maybe a good example from South Africa with regard to HIV policy, where civil society spent quite a lot of time advocating for HIV policy to be developed and funded. And here we saw quite a lot of civil society organizations working with parliamentarians to identify the needs from constituencies, in a way that the Ministry of Finance even allocated HIV funding, funding for treatment without treatment policy. And here we saw members of parliament getting very excited to see that actually there was money for HIV treatment, even though the Department of Health was saying we don't have enough money and we are not going to develop this policy. But then parliament was able to work with civil society to push on this policy to be developed. But then we also saw the courts coming into the picture in terms of using the court to force the Ministry of Health to develop the policy. It was quite exciting to see civil society and parliamentarians working together to have the right policy being developed and also to have it implemented. So basically, I think here it's about saying, is Parliament able to identify the right stakeholders who can help them engage with these policy issues?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second question with regard to engaging or monitoring monitoring the budget, also working with civil society organizations. We know that a lot of civil society organizations are engaging with the budget process by monitoring implementation. And there's quite a lot of inputs we have seen from civil society organizations, basically on how the budget is being used or how the budget is not working for people, and also trying to seek assistance from parliaments to intervene. So in this area, I think parliamentarians could actually do some kind of a stakeholder mapping to identify the right civil society groups can assist them with evidence on to inform their budget engagement with government.
Mm.
And also working with or identifying parliamentary researchers and assisting them with the skills to do budget tracking. I think that would actually help a lot in parliament to have some parliamentary researchers do budget monitoring, and also getting capacity from civil society partners to be able to do this analysis from the inside, and then use that analysis to inform the portfolio committee discussions and debates.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing something from Safia from South Africa, who notes that the Minister of Finance has called for zero-based budgeting as a strategy for dealing with COVID-19.
Oh wow, yeah. I think that is quite important because COVID-19 is a new issue that has never been budgeted for in the past. Mm. And we did not know how much resources were needed. So I think using zero-based budgeting is an excellent point, because basically we are starting from scratch. We do not know what we are dealing with. We do not know how much we should be investing. So we basically need to start with a clean slate.
Okay. And I have maybe one last question. I hope I'm not monopolizing all the questions. So we heard as well, I think from Shiba, about the allocation of resources from development partners. So noting that a lot of the gender programs are being financed by external stakeholders, and that means that there's less predictability in terms of that funding. And I think in past presentations, I've heard that it's the same case for a lot of what constitutes women's, children's, and adolescent health programming writ large. Is there anything that parliamentarians can do around ensuring more predictability of funding for women's, children's, and adolescent health?
I think that's quite an important question. I think it needs a session on its own because it's quite a big, it's a big group. I mean, it's a big question that the group should be looking at. So the question, I think, would be about sustainability of these programs. And we also know that a lot of donors will be transitioning out of the countries So the question is, when they go, how will we sustain ourselves? So I think this issue of finding new sources of domestic financing is quite important to say. So if the donors are going, how can we ensure we sustain these programs? So basically emphasizing more on domestic financing. So what is it that we as a country can do? If we see that the funding is not really sufficient, can we learn to be more efficient to make sure that we do more with less? I think that is the struggle that most African governments are struggling with, in terms of saying we want to do more, but we do not have enough time. I mean, we do not have enough money. So can we spend time to look at how can we better utilize the resources that we have? So by being efficient, we could actually cut a lot of inefficiencies and save money to do other things. So I think the solution is basically to look at the fiscus and say, how can we better mobilize resources internally to be able to do what we want to do without the donors.
Super. Thank you for that. I see that Sheba has her hand raised, so maybe let's give her the last word, Sheba.
Right, my name is Sheba. It's pronounced like a double E, but it's a single E.
Sorry,
So it's Sheba.
Sheba.
Okay.
Right, good, now you got it right. Now, the little bit I want to say is that, you see, to get donor funding, there are conditions and contracts and agreements that precede the disbursements of funds for anything that a donor wishes to do for a country or through the ministry or whatnot. I believe that we also need to be pretty fastidious in making sure that we meet all the conditions, because even if it's donor funding, that money, excuse me to say, or pardon my French, is not lying on the streets to be picked up. You know, it is whoever is supporting you is also giving you some of their taxpayers' money. So you need to be accountable for what you're taking. So I believe it's very important that all the preceding the conditions precedent to the disbursement of funds and to the agreement of the amounts and all those things need to be done on a timely basis and in the right way, because it's not only my country or your country that needs some assistance from anybody else. You know, so it's a pot where everybody is accessing. You know, so if you want to access that, then you need to be on the right track. You need to have your paperwork all done well. You need to know when you're going to spend what, this is going to be dispersed. You know, maybe I'm just a bit confused, but let's make sure that we all satisfy the conditions precedent, the conditions during, and the conditions after. You know, you do a proper auditing of your donor funding, so that the next time when you present your report, the next time you need something, it comes to you. You know, but we can't keep saying, oh, the funding doesn't come, the donor funds do not come in, when you may be at fault. You know, so let's be on guard as well, because if you've not satisfied whatever conditions come with the money, you're not getting it. If you get the funds and you decide to put it elsewhere, next time you're not going to get it. You know, you're not the only one who wants it. It's as simple as that. So we all have a part to play in it. You know, getting it, using it, accounting for it, and then asking for more. You know, so let's just bear that in mind as well.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that, Ms. Sheba. I think that is quite important. Also noting the issue around conditionalities, because we know that donor funding may come, but it comes with specific conditions that are not really working for us. So the issue around harmonization and making sure that we align, or donors align their funding with our national strategies is extremely important. But also, as you are saying, for us to be able to commit to the agreement that we have signed with the donors.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any final parting thoughts from anyone? Questions that haven't been answered? I see that we're at time. So I will just thank everyone again for their participation in this session, and thank you, Nhlanhla, for what was a very enlightening presentation with some very clear entry points for parliamentary staff around how to make sure that the budget process works for women, children, and adolescent health. Particularly around what they can do in the 4 stages of the budget process. With that, I think I want to thank everyone for participating. I'm seeing here that someone is asking for another training. Yes, of course, we would love to hear from you. And as a matter of fact, Miriam has just put in a link for a survey for the training series. So do let us know what you think. Do feel free to reach out to us and tell us what aspects were adequately covered, which ones would require more work and information, and we'll work around to try to get you that. We want to make sure that we're actually responding to your needs as much as possible. I want to say on behalf of all of the organizers that it's been an absolute pleasure participating in the most interesting discussions over the past 3 weeks, and that we look forward to doing this again or continuing this in some way.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for participating in this session.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye, guys.
Thank you.